let's get started. Welcome. It's really great to have you here this afternoon for this very special discussion. My name is Joe McCartan. I'm the director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative here at Georgetown. And I'd like to thank several people for making this event possible, especially the staff of KI and Alexis Harper, who you've seen running around getting everything set up for us today. Special thanks for them. Also to our friends at Dissent Magazine, who are helping with this event and who are behind the book we're here to celebrate today. So I'm really proud to welcome you to this very special event commemorating the publication of this book, Labor's Partisans, Essential Writings on the Union Movement from the 1950s to today. It's a book that collects essays, as I think everybody here knows, that were published in Dissent Magazine over a period of 70 years, from its founding in the mid-50s until just recently. Dissent was founded in 1954, just a little over 70 years ago, by a group of New York intellectuals, including Louis Kosar, Rose Loeb Kosar, Irving Howe, Norman Mailer, Harry Pachter, and Meyer Shapiro, among others. Under Irving Howe's editorship, it emerged as the nation's leading journal of ideas informed by democratic socialism. And over its long and illustrious life, down to the present, it's been the host and the home of many great writers: Norman Mailer, Michael Harrington, Harvey Swados, David Brody, my own mentor, Mel Dubofsky, Dorothy Sue Cobble, Eileen Boris, Nelson Lichtenstein, Sarah Jaffe, among others. And we're lucky that Nelson Lichtenstein and his former student, Samir Santi, have edited the essays that are now part of this book. It couldn't be a more important time for us to consider the history of labor and to think big about where labor now stands and where it's headed. But you'll be hearing more about that in a moment. Let me just say a word about the panel that we've assembled here, which we're so delighted to have. We couldn't have a better panel to discuss these writings and this book, because each of them have a special relationship to Dissent, but also to the Kalmanovitz Initiative. First, on the other side of me along the table here is Jules Bernstein. Jules was a student of Irving Howe's in the 1950s at the time this magazine was being founded. He's been part of its orbit ever since. And when he went on to become one of the nation's leading labor lawyers, he also emerged as one of Dissent's most important benefactors. And as anybody in this city knows and anybody around labor knows, Jules has been a benefactor of many causes having to do with advancing working people in their rights. He's also been a dear friend of the Kalmanovitz Initiative. Closer to me here is Michael Kazin. Michael is my colleague in the history department here at Georgetown. We arrived here together in 1999. It seems like only yesterday, Michael. Ever since, Michael's sort of been my big brother as an intellectual, somebody that I've always looked to as a guiding light for how to do intellectual work that also matters in the world. He's also currently writing a new biography of Samuel Gompers. I think it's an important time to reconsider the Gompers legacy. Michael has a long association with Dissent, been on its editorial board since 2000, also edited the magazine for quite a while. And he's also been a crucial and important friend of KI over the years since we were founded in 2009, 10 years after I got here. And then joining us online, we're so delighted to have Ruth Milkman. Ruth is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology, jointly appointed to both CUNY's School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY's Graduate Center. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Ruth is the leading sociologist of American labor. She's written widely on topics having to do with workers and the labor movement, especially on issues concerning gender, race, and immigration, which she has contributed an important essay on in this book. And I can't think of a more important time for us to consider the question of immigrant workers in this country than this present moment. So we're delighted to have this panel. I will first welcome my colleague Lane Wyndham to just say a word about what this panel fits in a larger scheme we're working on this spring called Labor Spring. And then we'll turn to our colleague James Benton to lead the discussion. Let me welcome Lane up here. Lane Wyndham, Associate Director of the Account Management Center.
Welcome to the third or fourth of Georgetown's Labor Spring events. We're thrilled to have you here. Labor Spring is a series of over 80 events that happen on campuses and communities to support worker rights. And we have a committee of over 100 faculty, students, environmentalists, labor unions, worker centers, et cetera, who help make these events happen all over the country. And it's everything from panels like this to films to conferences. Some of my favorite events are the ones where unions come onto the campus and just talk with students about, what unions are, what they do. And the KI is extremely proud to be the founder, the organizer, and the anchor of Labor Spring. This is now our third year running. And so I urge you to check out a Labor Spring events near you. You can do that on our website. It's laborspring.org. And it's not too late to organize your own event. So now I will turn it over to James Benton.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, and welcome to everyone, both on Zoom and in our audience here at Georgetown University. We want to have as lively a discussion as possible, so I urge the folks in both audiences, online and physically present, to please put questions. If you're on Zoom, please put them in the chat. If you're seated in the audience, please raise your hand. We want to make this hour as lively an exchange of information and ideas as we can muster. So without any further ado, I will start with an initial question. It's directed at each of the members of the panel. When Dissent got its start 70 years ago, it was at a time when labor density in this country was at its highest point. Fast forward to 2025, 2024, the latest report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that it's probably one of the lowest points in history, about 11%. There have been numerous triumphs, numerous defeats, numerous challenges over those 70 years since the founding of Dissent. And so the question to the panel, first of all, to Jules Bernstein, I want you to take us back and then come forward as to your observations about what the feeling around labor was like when Dissent was getting its start, and how you've seen that change over time.
I wish I'd had the questions in advance. So I've got
It's in the university, Jules.
I don't do it in court. But thinking about that, I thought the high point might have been roughly 1960 or thereafter, because when I was in college sophomore, when Irving Howe, Lou Kozer, and the others started Dissent, and in my case, I was thrilled about it because it was a bad period. Eisenhower was president. Fortunately, that was also the year of Brown versus School Board, so we made some important progress there. But those Eisenhower years were not necessarily good for labor. They started I think, to improve when Jack Kennedy was elected, when the Democrats came back, when the National Labor Relations Board became Democratic versus its being Republican for 8 years during the administration of Eisenhower. In 1952, President, this is a good segue, President Truman seized the steel mills at the time of an anticipated steel strike. Unions had taken a hit from the Taft-Hartley Act in 47. There was an anti-communist provision in the Taft-Hartley Act, sections 9, 7, G, H, G and H, which said in order to be a union official, or to have your union go to the NLRB, you had to sign an anti-communist affidavit. And so that applied to everyone. Most trade unionists did it, but those who did it, some of them were prosecuted for filing a false affidavit with the government. So that the 50s were not a good period for unions. Things started to get better and increasingly got better thereafter, up until, let's say, when Ronald Reagan fired 13,000 traffic controllers. I don't know how many here had ever heard about it.
He's got to write a book about it.
So that's kind of, we went up from the Kennedy period to Reagan, and then things started to go down because workers were fearful. And we are now at the period of the largest mass firing of workers in the history of this country.
Ruth Milkman, I put the same question to you, but try interpret it through your lens of immigration, the work that you've done on immigrant workers, gender, race over that intervening period.
Thanks. Before I try to answer you, I want to just thank you guys for organizing this event and to thank, I guess they're not here, but the editors of the book that we're celebrating for their great work. Samir Santi, my colleague here at CUNY, and Nelson Lichtenstein at UC Santa Barbara, who I think this is a wonderful service to the labor movement and to progressives more generally. I love the fact that it's a collaboration between these two different generations. And I guess I'm not quite as, I haven't been around quite as long as Jules, but I can remember the PATCO strike quite vividly and all the things that have changed since then. And Dissent has been a home for, people who want to figure out what all that means. But to get back to your question, even, I have this joke I sometimes have told in giving talks about gender in the labor movement, and it goes like this. There's an old saying, women get a ticket to ride after the gravy train has left the station. And it's not just women, but other groups that had been marginal to the labor movement historically, who, as the labor movement has gotten weaker in various ways, have a bigger role in it. And so that's sort of an ironic commentary on some of the things that have unfolded in the last few decades. And well, so that's a positive thing, but I don't think it's an accident that we now have a female president of the AFL-CIO at a time when, as Jules pointed out, the organized labor is, at a lowest ebb in more than probably in a century. So that's one thing. At the same time, I feel that in the period since the magazine Dissent was founded, the movement has moved in a more progressive direction in regard to, are you still allowed to say the word diversity? That is,
Huh.
it's become, people of color are more present than they were historically. Women are, and then, as you all know, I think, and I think this is what you wanted me to address, the AFL-CIO and many individual affiliates, as well as unions that aren't part of the AFL-CIO, have really changed their views about immigrant workers and increasingly embraced the immigrant rights movement, which was not the case as recently as the 1980s. So that's all positive, but it doesn't mean much if the movement itself is in collapse. So, you know, we have to balance those things as we think about this.
Okay, thank you. And finally, I'll turn to Mike Kazin, who edited this and is an expert on social movements, we know, in American history. What are your observations about what we've seen with labor in this country over the past 7 years?
Yeah, just a little tiny little question, you know.
We do small questions.
First, I too want to thank Joe and everyone at the KI and Lane and everybody else, you know, everyone else who's helped organize this. And it's humbling to see people in the audience who have been involved in the labor movement, as I've not been, Alan Smith and Debbie Goldman, many other people. So Karen Westbound. So I really want to hear what you all have to say as much as what we have to say. But maybe instead of answering that large question, let me talk a little bit dissent and organized labor. You know, dissent was founded by people who had been socialists, some have been Trotskyists, but labor was central to what they meant, not just by socialism, but by having a decent society. And Irving Howe had co-written a biography of Walter Reuther, there were people from the labor movement who wrote for dissent at the time, as well as a lot of people who wrote about it. There were big debates about labor democracy. There were big debates about whether the new working class, which some people now call the PMC, professional managerial class, would be as open to unionism as industrial workers were. And that's still an open question, even though grad students, I think, now are the most pro-labor group of workers in America, which is both good and bad, if you think about it. Grad students are not exactly, you know, the center of the working class, and they don't remain grad students. They hope they're not going to remain grad students for very long. So, but then I think is always it's labor coverage. You can see this from the book. I had sort of presentation, which I won't give, which talks about this. I've always had a tension between what people who wrote for dissent would like labor to be doing and the power that they would like organized workers to have, and workers in general to have, organized or not, and the realities of American society, in which even when labor was as strong as it was numerically in the 1950s and 60s, was still, you know, was a very much at best a junior part in the New Deal coalition at the time. And then, as Jules mentioned, by the 80s, there was no longer a New Deal coalition, and of course, labor had to struggle to keep what influence it still had in the government and in workplaces as well. So dissent's always struggled between the visionary idea of labor and the exigencies of what it's like to organize unions. And you can see that actually in there's a wonderful, really pretty lengthy dialogue in the book between young organizers. I can't remember their names. Luis Feliz Leon, Sarah Nelson, not so young, the head of the flight attendants union, and Daisy Pitkin, who's organized documented workers in laundries, industrial laundries in the Southwest, and now she's working with Starbucks workers as well. And they, if you read it, which I hope you will when you buy the book, they really straddle this sense of the great possibilities, the great potential for labor to, you know, be the bedrock of a decent society, what, you know, people on dissent would call a social democratic society, and all the hurdles against that. But for a while, you know, people on dissent had an incredibly, perhaps too optimistic a sense. Michael Harrington, who, you know, Joe mentioned, and I'm sure pretty much everyone here has heard of, the most important socialist in America from 1970s and until his death in 1989. He wrote an article in 1972 for Dissent. Just let me quote a couple things in that article, which give you a sense of that optimism. And the article was about old working class, new working class. He said, unions are in domestic politics constitute an American kind of de facto social democracy. He said that when George Meany was the head of the AFL-CIO. And a few months later, George Meany would make sure that the AFL-CIO did not endorse George McGovern for president, in a sense giving a victory to Richard Nixon, who of course won a landslide in his second term. And also something else which actually Ruth was mentioning in the same article, Harrington says, labor is the most integrated single institution in US society. It has done more to raise the living standards of Black Americans than any force except the federal government. And that's the thing that, people on Dissent were talking about, that the relation between the civil rights movement, the Black freedom movement, and the labor movement for a long time before a lot of people really began to write it, before historians actually began to write about it in serious ways, I think. And even though labor is weaker, of course, in terms of numbers than it was, that I think is still true. It is the largest integrated single institution in American society. I can't think of another one. I don't want to talk for long here, but this has always been Dissent's project, I think, when labor is concerned. To think about what labor can be, and yet to be sobered by what labor is. And that tension is one that people on the left in America deal with all the time. But you don't have to be Marxist to know that working people are essential to building a better society.
Yes.
One comment in response to Michael's comment. At the AFL-CIO convention in 1959.
We were all there. We were all there.
I wasn't there. Actually, I was at law school at the time. But Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, got up and complained and had a resolution about eliminating all of the situations where AFL-CIO affiliates had segregated locals. And he got shouted down by George Meany, it's on film, saying, "Who appointed you, Brother Randolph?" Because Randolph had been a vice president of the AFL for a very long time, the spokesperson for all of Black America, Black workers, and the AFL-CIO, I know this because I was working in the laborers union right across the street, did not attend the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. They sent everybody home on March 28, 1963. Now, that's where it was. But it's come a long way. I mean, it's come as far as it could have come since. That's the important point, is that the labor movement has caught up to where it ought to be, but it was sad that it wasn't where it should have been in 1963. I mean, the UAW was the principal union involved in the March on Washington. So, I mean, the truth never dies. It just lives a miserable life. So, I guess my point here is the labor movement has woken up. And it's a different labor movement. That's great. But now we need to have the country catch up. Unfortunately, there are people in the labor movement who are regressing. As we know, in certain unions, as a matter of fact, Trumpists have taken over. So that's very problematic for me to see union leaders, and maybe that they're responsive to their members. It's just not their idea. So that's problematic, and that we have to think about and do something about.
Ruth, did you have anything that you wanted to add at this point?
Well, so to just counter some of the gloom and doom, I want to just make one point, which I think everyone in this meeting is aware of, but just to remind you, we do have a generation of young progressives who have breathed some new life into this, what often appears to be a dying movement. And I think we've all seen that emerge since the pandemic. In some ways, it started a little before that, but really took off in this decade. And that's the one thing that makes me hopeful. Public attitudes have also become more pro-labor in recent years, as you all know. And so despite the grim political situation that we're facing, I feel like, that generation is the future, and that gives me some hope of a potential labor revival. There's another, I don't know, I think this is making me feel old because I keep remembering these ancient, sort of stories that I've told many times, and maybe some of you have heard before, but I'll just at the risk of boring you, I'll do it one more time. As you may know, in the early 1930s, there's this story of the then, I've forgotten his name, but the president of the American Economic Association at the time, in his presidential address, I believe it was in 1932, the subject was trade unionism, and he basically said the labor movement is dead. This is a historical phenomenon now. You know how economists aren't interested in things that don't have big numbers. And then, a few years later, we saw the rise of the CIO. So that doesn't mean it will happen again. I'm not suggesting that there's any, assurance of that. But history is full of surprises, and I don't think we should write off this new generation who, I see it in my students, who are deeply committed to breathing new life into what sometimes seems like a movement that just refuses to die.
I make one quick comment?
Sure.
One of the interesting things which is happening, there are some people on the, I wouldn't call it Trumpist right necessarily, but certainly on the right, who are, at least rhetorically, not just pro-working people, but pro-union, I've become kind of friends with a guy named Sohrab Ahmari. People know his work and all. He found Compact Magazine. He is calls himself a pro-life New Dealer. He goes to labor notes conferences. He wrote a very interesting book called Tyranny Incorporated, which is a wonderful sort of diatribe with lots of details about how corporations rip off consumers, rip off workers. And he's written for Dissent, actually, just once. We had breakfast about a month ago in New York, and he claims, he says, actually, J.D. Vance is really very pro-union. Well, as we used to say when I was growing up, I'm very old too, 15 cents. For 15 cents, I'll get you on the subway. But still, there's a sense, I think, and this is one of the things which got Trump elected, I think, a sense that and driving, what's forth is for Trump's tariff, including among, from people like the head of the UAW, which is a sense that, corporations have been ripping off America, that working people are not organized. As we've said, recent Gallup poll, 70% of Americans are in favor of unions. But there's a gap, I think, between, that kind of consciousness and the fact that young people are pro-union, but there's a lack, because unions have been in decline for a while, there's a real lack of any knowledge of actually, if you want to organize a union, how do you do it? In the 50s and 60s, people came from union families and they had a sense of what it was like, but I think it's more difficult now. But again, that's the kind of thing that, we like to argue about in Dissent.
Yeah. The conversation in the past 10 minutes or so has really focused, and I think you mentioned this in passing, around power. And looking at these essays, they do talk about labor, but if you take them another way, you can sense the struggle between labor and business and the government and other social movements adjacent to labor that are all fighting for power, how to acquire it, how to wield it, how to achieve ends with it. And I guess my question is, at this moment, borrowing some of what Ruth had just said about reversing the gloom and doom. I think you saw my notes from New York. I'm just saying, because the past few years we've got Amazon, Starbucks, REI workers organizing, reaching new generations, as you mentioned, and in areas largely seen as off limits to the labor movement. You've seen the new militancy in the UAW and the stand-up strike of the fall of 23, the Association of Flight Attendants, even the Teamsters in their bargaining with UPS in 23. Resurgence of new militancy within the labor movement. And my question is this heralding not some big resurgence of labor, but is this signaling one of those shifts that have been traced through the pages of this book? This fight for power, this fight to gather and wield and use it to achieve ends.
Ruth, you want to address that?
I've learned the hard way that predicting the future is a very hazardous business, so I won't make any predictions. I do think that there is the embryo of something important in all the things that you just listed. And the question is that something that's going to just be snuffed out by the new political order that we're facing? And the kind of cowardly response to it, I have to say, by many people on the left end of the political spectrum, such as it is? Or is it going to be nourished and allowed to flourish? And to some extent, that depends on what the established union movement, what's left of it, does, and whether it, embraces this new generation of activists that are so eager to create a new kind of labor movement. And so far they haven't really stepped up, unfortunately, but I think that could make a big difference. It's hard to see a major upsurge in this political climate, I must say, given that we're arrayed against an administration that's determined to do exactly the opposite, to destroy what's left of the labor movement. But I don't think it's easy to predict any of this, and I would like us to keep our eye on this new generation and see what they figure out. If they had understood how dire things were, I just want to say one more thing. If they had understood how dire things were in 2020, I think the pandemic sort of raised people's awareness of worker exploitation and all that more generally, and of this young generation in particular. And if they had understood how hard it was to organize a union, maybe they wouldn't have tried. That knowledge is so obscure and marginal to the mainstream of even, left-wing politics. It's like inside baseball kind of stuff. Maybe they wouldn't have done it. But, there's a new book by Eric Blank, some of you may know, which is about this phenomenon. It's called We Are the Union. It's about Starbucks, Amazon, and all the rest of it. He interviewed a ton of this generation of activists. And one thing he points out is that through things like social media, they have managed to train one another in the arcana of winning an NLRB election, for example, in ways that are almost cost-free and sort of liquidate the old argument that, the formidable obstacles to organizing it's so expensive to overcome them that it doesn't really make sense for unions to invest in that. He argues that, well, you don't really have to do that now because they teach each other. And that is what happened at Starbucks, though, as we know. Not a whole lot has come of it just yet. I hope that will change, but I'm not sure. I'll leave it there.
Okay, Jules?
In 1970, I was representing a postal union, and we were faced with the fact that the government was not moving on a new contract. And this was at a time when there was not collective bargaining. They used to call it collective begging, postal union leaders. And the problem was in Congress, where wages were not negotiated, but legislated. And so when it was the administration, the Republicans, the Democrats, committees, and the postal workers were very frustrated. And guess what? some letter carriers in the Bronx just voted, the letter carrier branch in the Bronx voted like 1,800 to 1,000 to strike. At time, striking as it is now was a federal crime. And you could never get your job back under the federal statutes, which are still on the books. And 250,000 letter carriers and postal clerks and mail handlers and others hit the bricks and went out on strike. President Nixon first begged them to go back and then ordered them to go back, and they didn't go. They stood out there until they got relief. And somehow or other, and I was kind of involved in this, and I just want to put this on the record. The union, this is interesting too, the union leaders, letter carriers and clerks were fighting amongst themselves, and if the unions weren't together, it wasn't a good situation. Why were they fighting? That's an interesting labor law and labor relations point. The letter carriers then today had 97% of the people signed up without a union shop. They've had it, it's been like that since the Civil War. The letter carriers have become a letter carrier. You join the union. That's part of becoming a letter carrier. That wasn't true for the postal clerks. The postal clerks had a bare majority signed up on checkoff. And so the postal clerks wanted the union shop. And the letter carrier said, if you get the union shop, we're not going to be the big power here. So we want, anyhow, we want money. We don't need the union shop. They were fighting on stuff like that. So some people like me said, we got to do something here. We've got to get George Meany to get behind these workers and lead this strike. And I was a little worried that because it was an illegal strike, George Meany might be hesitant. But guess what? He came out 100%, led them right to the White House, and went nose to nose with Nixon, and it was settled. So you can't anticipate what's going to happen. As a matter of fact, I came back from Boston yesterday, and as I walked through the line to get clearance for security, I looked at these TSA people who the day before had their contract ripped up by the administration. And I thought to myself, what if they went out on strike? The country would be shut down. And so you don't know what's going to happen next in terms of thinking about, well, will this happen or that happen? You never know what's going to happen next. And in a situation like we have today, frankly, every time you turn around, they're beating down on people one way or the other. People from NOAA being fired, people from everywhere being fired. The working class in this country is going to say enough is enough before the labor leaders can figure out what to do. So that's my hope. And the other side seems not to care about how hard they beat down on people because they can get away with it. And they're going to push it as hard as they can. I will say one other thing, however, what I know, because I'm a lawyer, is I'm looking at all these cases that are being filed, and they're pretty strong cases. And even Supreme Court justices, I say we've got at least 5 votes on a number of these issues, DEI and the power of the president, authority of the president. And, I can go into detail, but I don't want to waste your time. But we're reacting in court, and the judges too. are not happy with what's going on because they believe in the rule of law, and the rule of law is being defined as it's never been defined before.
Yeah, quick comment, which probably people want to ask and know about and tell us about in the audience and on Zoom. Put my historian's hat on for a second. I think it's true that in downtimes for labor, when obviously when the state is not on labor's side, it's going to be a real time of sort of nurturing, a different labor movement. I think in the 1920s, for example, the Brookwood Labor College, other institutions like that, really were training organizers. And some of those people ended up being important organizers in the 30s. And also, the Communist Party was tiny and sectarian, as it kind of always was, with a few exceptions. But there were communists who were involved in organizing both within FML unions and with their own unions as well in the 20s, and getting experience, in other words, of learning how to organize people. There's one thing maybe put on the table about this. I mentioned the state, and obviously the state is now against labor, because it's against federal workers especially. One of the things that you can say a lot of bad things about Samuel Gompers, and I won't go into detail. He didn't have a chance to write for Dissent to defend himself, but he died in 1924. But one thing he did say, as people in the audience probably know, those who know that labor history, he says, don't depend on the state. You can work with the state, but don't depend on them, because what they can give you, they can also take away. And we might be at a time, at least for the next 4 years, where the labor board is still in business for a while at least. We'll see what happens in that. But the unions won't be able to depend on the labor board, and people want to organize unions won't be able to depend on the labor board. So we might be returning to a time like before the 1930s, when unions had to make it because they had to show how strong they were by striking, by boycotting, by being taken into court, because they boycotted. But this sort of, struggle unionism, might be returning. And also something else, one of the great things that the KI has done and that Joe and other people have written about is what they call common good unionism. I think that's one thing that federal workers now probably have a problem with, which is that a lot of people out there who don't work for the federal government like what the government does for them, but they probably don't shed many tears when federal workers get fired, unless they know them personally. Because people out there know what it's like to be fired, they know what it's like to lose their jobs, and I would say, well, they federal worker lost their jobs, but they have college educations, maybe they get other jobs. What's important is connecting people who are getting fired to what they were doing that was helping Americans, especially working class Americans. And I think that's sort of the germ of, in many ways, of what common good unionism is all about. And it's, I think, the most important idea that's come up in the labor movement for quite a while. Unfortunately, and Joe wrote an article about it for Dissent, I think, a while back. And more people should be practicing it as well as talking about it.
Okay, at this point, we want to turn it to questions from the audience, and I see that we have a question that just came in from the chat, and I'll read that out while you ruminate on what question to ask. Eric Blanc has written about the potential power of federal workers' unions to lead movement towards a national level labor coalition with real power. And the question is, what do you think of that?
Well, what I said before, I'm not sure. Again, I'm just a historian. I'm not an activist. I'm not an organizer. I've never been a member of a union, unfortunately. So I think we're organizing the AUP chapter on campus, so that will join one. Is that actually a union? Well, kind of professional organization anyway. But I think, I think that, some federal workers can probably serve that role. But especially those who have those relationships with communities, the federal workers in DC who are technical workers who don't have much dealing with most working people serve that role. That's what dubious about it. Yeah.
If they're, okay, we have several hands.
Yep.
We're gonna go with Mike.
First of all, I think, if we think back to the 1950s, the labor movement, we have to be sort of self-critical as why the labor movement began to collapse after the death party. In other words, we have, why was there such a big downturn? There's the whole anti-communist campaign. The Social Democrats certainly never stood up and defended them. The liberals never stood up and defended them. And that whole leadership in the UAW and the UE and the dock workers union was pretty much wiped out. And I think after that was a continued decline in the labor movement. So I think to rebuild the labor movement, you need a serious, committed political leadership, which has somewhat of a revolutionary outlook. And we don't have that. And personally, I think unless we begin to build that, we're not going to turn this thing around, basically. And there's the strategic unions like the UPS, like the postal workers, like the transit workers. They need better leadership, which has that outlook. Our union, the ATU, Local 689, I mean, we rely too much on the politicians. We think that, Wes Moore is going to help us, Muriel Bowser is going to help us. No, our power lies in our ability to shut this city down. We can rally other workers at Pepco, at Verizon to our side, then we can exert real power. But we don't have that type of leadership. The last time we did it was 1978, when a handful of communists shut down the city for 6 days. And, Metro never messed with it for the next 40 years. Now we're all retired or dead, and let's go at them again.
Just for the record, you really should know that Dissent and the people around it defended communists who were being persecuted politically. They were very principled about it, not like the communists who supported the prosecution in 1940 of the Trotskyists for conspiracy, and 18 Trotskyists from Minneapolis went to jail. The communist movement was not what you're making it out sound to be, but I don't want to get into that argument now. Yes.
Good to meet you. Right here.
I don't think I was the first.
Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, Eleanor LaCane, thanks so much for doing this. The reason I'm here is I'm deeply concerned, as we all are, about what's happening right now. And I see unions as absolutely essential for fighting for the freedoms of America and keeping our democracy. I just heard Timothy Snyder, professor at Yale, wrote the book On Tyranny. He's an expert on authoritarian regimes. And he talked about you cannot have resistance to authoritarianism without having unions and union activism. So I know we're maybe at a low point here for unions, but still my understanding is there's about 60 unions in the AFL-CIO. There's about 15 million active members and retired members. If we didn't have unions, we'd have to invent them because people are in working conditions, corporations are greedy and mean, and we need ways to organize and defend ourselves. So given that we do have the numbers and some strength still in the unions, and like Jules just reminded us, what if the TSA goes out on strike after their agreement gets ripped up? Boom, shut the country down. I'd love to know, because you're all so steeped in the history and knowledge of unions historically, what do you see could be done with unions now, given the kind of rapid march to tyranny that we're on? And if you were the president of the AFL, what would you be doing, and what can we as citizens do to support union workers?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, we're cautioned, as most people in the audience know, people don't join unions primarily because of political reasons. They join unions because they want a better life, better wages, less authoritarianism at the workplace, some job security, some benefits. And with all respect to the gentleman over here, most Americans don't want a revolution. They want a better life. It's when that possibility is completely threatened, is when, people get political, some people did join unions in the 1930s because they thought that fascism was on the rise, because they saw big business as an authoritarian institution, which had also failed the country because it helped to cause the Depression. But I think, the problem is there are lots of different unions and there are lots of different priorities, obviously. We don't have union federations like they do in Europe, at least historically, where there's, fringe unions all go on general strike together against raising the retirement age, as they did Macron tried to raise retirement age to 64. And they failed, and it wasn't just unions, but unions were important in that, even though union density in France is no greater than it is in the United States. And that's true in Italy too, it's true historically in Spain as well, but there's not that tradition in the United States for the most part of all unions going out together, for political ends. Maybe that'll change. I hope it does, but again, and I agree with you here that leadership is really important. And there is nobody who's seen the way John Lewis was for a while as the CIO, the way Gompers was, the way Terrence Powderly was back in the 1880s as the voice of labor, the leader of labor. They put sort of just look to this man, of course they're all men, to outline a strategy for those who are in unions. And without that, it's going to take hard work and a coalition to do it. But I think it's certainly true. The federal workers are the ones right now who are getting screwed, and they're the ones who are going to have to lead this.
Yeah.
Yes, picking up on this discussion about solidarity and methods, I think Jules is right about the structure to stack against labor, but one area that puzzles me is in the federal workforce, because while generally the percentage of organized workers is really weak, that's not true of the public sector. And the public sector is far more populous with union workers than the private sector. And they've spent a lot of energy and time, sometimes occasional militancy, building up their strength. But where are they at this moment of perhaps greatest crisis? It seems that they're not idle. It seems like where they are is in court. And it seems like that's the main response so far. And like maybe we have too many lawyers. I mean, the question, why is the strategy so far so overbalanced towards the legal and court strategy? And why do, particularly the public sector, Joe probably knows more about this than anybody I can think of, but anybody else I can think of, but why the public sector unions, are they not coming up with other strategies? Because they have in the past, even as recently as during COVID, when there was effectively a sit out, slow down, and yet I haven't seen anything about that.
Well, first, each federal employee who has been canned rights. What the AFL-CIO Lawyers Organization is doing is recruiting 1,000 lawyers and training them, because I work in this area, I mean, federal employee rights. It's really very difficult to work in that environment. It's complex. And so what the AFL-CIO Lawyers Group is trying to do is see to it that each individual has a lawyer and is protected, because if you don't file this by this date and that date, you waive your rights. So there's a requirement of a lot of lawyering. My perspective about this is the more lawyers, the better. No, I'm serious. I'm the kind of guy who says, when you want lawyers out of the picture, I've been a union lawyer, and I say, I don't want to go in that meeting. You get my drift. I don't want to be involved. I don't want them to, the union lawyers are usually people who say no, and the union leader wants to hear yes. Right. So, but this is a situation where lawyers have to get in there for individual workers and beyond. And I will have to say, historically, those unions, NTEU, AFGE, they've really had superb lawyers. And so has the AFL-CIO. So the problem isn't that the problem is too many lawyers. Workers need lawyers. But the other part of the question, I don't have an answer, frankly. But I will have to say, I think that there have been very good unions in the federal sector historically. And, but they're overwhelmed. It's just difficult for them to get anything done at this point.
We have time for about 2 more questions and then we have to wrap because we're gonna hit 5:30. So Debbie,
Okay, well, I was going to ask a historical question about dissent and how you discussed the tension with the Democratic Party, but I'm not, because I've been inspired by these comments. And I want to speak what I think Joe might have said. We have to recognize that the collective bargaining structure for federal employees is not the same as for state and local government. It's very restricted. They cannot bargain over wages and benefits. So it's been limited primarily, I'm not talking about postal workers, but the others, primarily limited to working conditions. Therefore, many individuals, unfortunately, in the federal sector have not joined the union. It's not the same kind of power base as in when you have full collective bargaining rights, which themselves are limited in this country. So, as Joe has written so beautifully in his book, if you have weak unions, that often means your strategic and your power is not the same thing. And the second thing I would say, I'm retired, but those of us in this room know people who are working the federal government. Right now, the fear is just intense. I go to a demonstration at least 2 or 3 times a week. And very few federal workers show up because they're afraid. They know their pictures are going to be taken. They know that this could affect whether they're the next one to be fired. So let's be real. And this is what I liked about the way you talked about what dissent did. When is it that people rise up? Yes, it's when you're really, either you have nothing to lose, or you know that you're taking that risk is going to have an impact. And therefore, thinking that it's only militant that is going to make the difference, and that the state has no role. It's both. We need to be doing our sit downs. We need to be doing our rallies. Today, there were hundreds of DC residents up on Capitol Hill telling that those senators have a backbone, because otherwise this continuing resolution is going to take $1 billion that we DC residents and our city council and our mayor have approved. But this continuing resolution will take it away. Have a backbone. Hundreds of people are up there. A few are that they are afraid. And we need to help them not feel afraid. I'm sorry for standing on a soapbox right now, but we all need to help them.
I agree. I think one of the important lessons we've learned in this, and the DC situation is a good example. For race, Black Lives Matter, and will be treated then. Do this and will be. You cannot compromise with autocracy. Yeah. There's only one thing to do when there's an autocrat. What countries have done all over the world, which is, I won't call it a general strike, but I would certainly say much more collective action. Now, I happen to live across the street from Noah, and there were many federal workers, many people joining them. For my birthday, we sang in front of the White House, which is now completely fenced off, the people's house, right? but you cannot get through Lafayette Park. We cannot allow this. And there's no compromise. You have to stand up. You cannot compromise with autocracy.
Ruth, did you have observations?
Well, my money's on the young people. This, I call it the post-Occupy Wall Street generation who, you know, were the troops for Bernie Sanders' campaign, for Black Lives Matter, for Me Too, for a lot of the other movements that we've seen and now have embraced labor. So if there's any hope for the future, it lies in their energies. And I have to say, they are not afraid. They've been through so much already in their short lives that I think they're fairly fearless, which is maybe quite different from the labor establishment, what's left of it. But we'll see.
Coming to, you know, poor old Joe Biden, you know, he was amazingly pro-union, you know.
That's
We discussed why that didn't really help, and, you know, presidents, even a better president than Joe Biden, they don't organize unions, you know, workers organize unions. But still, that, it was a tilt, you know, towards unions under his administration because there was pressure, you know, from below. You know, Joe Biden did not come into office, you know, being, you know, want to be the second coming of Franklin D. Roosevelt, but you know, he did his best, you know, let's put it that way. I think there's one more question out there.
Yeah, I'm conducting research with a grassroots government union of Fairfax County workers. And one of the issues they're facing in collective bargaining representation speaks to a lot of the issues that other folks have raised about people being afraid and not wanting to join. And I was wondering if you could speak to how the 2018 Supreme Court ruling on Janus versus AFSCME would affect the prospects of smaller unions, since it, you know, maintains that people don't have to pay dues in those governmental unions, even though they'll be getting that representation.
I think we need a labor lawyer.
There's also an author of a column that appears in this journal who is in the room, but we'll defer to the labor one.
Well, I don't have an answer to how to overcome the open shop movement and public employment. But what I'd say is, if we just focus on labor, we're making a mistake. I was with Reverend Barber, and he's got many religious figures coming to Capitol Hill every week. And there are many groups in the country that are active. Bob Reich, if you get his emails, he's got many ideas about what ought to be done. And Indivisible is doing many things. So this is just not anti-labor, put it that way. This is anti-democracy, anti-freedom, anti-black, whatever. I would, you know, the whole idea of shutting down DEI is just racist. So basically, all minorities are being undone in terms of rights. So it's a national question rather than just labor. Labor's got to do its share, but others are involved, and we have to have a broad coalition. When I was a kid, you remember it, the American Veterans Committee. I thought the American Veterans Committee was the most liberal organization out there. And one would hope that veterans can get themselves together, because there are so many of them, and they're being taken advantage of as well. So that's the kind of point. Coalitions beyond labor.
Joe, you want to address that question, Janice?
You know, I don't want to do that at this point. Nobody can follow Jules.
We talk after we finish.
Yeah, I'm gonna be around, and I'm happy to give individual answers to everybody.
So we're at 5:35, and it's time to conclude. But before we go, I do want to ask the panelists if they had a couple of seconds for a brief comment or two in conclusion.
Ruth, you want to start?
Sure. I'd just like to say that in these very dangerous times, journals like Dissent, and I would say Jacobin and Jewish Currents and N+1 and the young generation of journals as well, are really an important place for us to figure this stuff out. And so I think this book, again, which I guess is the official occasion where its publication being the official occasion that we're all together for, really shows the power of that kind of forum. And so I hope that we'll all continue to be part of that community of not just around Dissent, but the other progressive journals that have emerged. I mean, social media is all very well, but it's pretty fragile and evanescent. This stuff will be around. And I think there's, that makes it really important. So I just, again, want to thank Samir and Nelson for putting the book together and for you guys for pulling together this event to celebrate it.
First of all, it's really great to see Ruth again. I think we've known each other for 40 years. I think we worked on a magazine called Socialist Review, right?
Oh, another one. Yes, absolutely. It was my graduate school education came largely out of that collection.
Anyway, so, all of us white hairs here and, around the block. Yeah, I mean, I'll second what Ruth says, and, Antonio Gramsci, who also did get a chance to write for Dissent, has this famous line, you probably heard, those who know the history of the left, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I wouldn't say we shouldn't just necessarily be pessimistic, but we should, be sober, let's say, and not expect, great things to happen sort of spontaneously. But at the same time, if people have the will, then a lot of things are possible. And one of the great things about this book, and I want to thank Jules for helping to bring it to life with his resources, is that you can read arguments, about how to get people who have the will to organize unions and how to get people who don't have the will to get the will to organize unions. So in that sense, it's, I think, the best kind of a teaching tool, if you will, about the past and to some degree present of unions. Anyway, thanks again to KI for doing this, and let Jules have the last word.
There's 2 points. First, one of the tragedies here is we are on the verge of getting into the period of artificial intelligence, which will have a huge impact on our society. And the question is, what will that be? And that's where our government, our unions, our businesses have to focus in terms of the potential harm that will come out of that. I mean, imagine that 400,000 owner operators of trucks. Those used to be Teamsters, but they're no longer Teamsters because that union was broken in terms of over-the-road drivers. They're going to be replaced by driverless trucks within 20 years. So that's one side of it. It's really tough that this is happening once. I thought to myself, how will this period be remembered? I came up with the Great Regression. I don't think that's good enough, but that's for the moment anyhow. And we've got to fight it.
All right, thank you. And on that note, we want to thank our audience here in Washington and online on Zoom. Thanks again for your attendance this afternoon, and look forward to.
Do we have any books for sale?
Yes, we do.
For sale.
Thank you, James and panelists. We have books for sale. So come right up and buy one. We can take, we have refreshments out there to sustain you while you wait to buy your book. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you being here. Books are at a discount, $25.